Welcome to the second installation of our Integrated Activism slideshows. This is a slideshow covering the second chapter of the book, Integrated Activism, Applying the Hidden Connections Between Ecology, Economics, Politics, and Social Progress. The second chapter of the book discusses the development of democracy and civil liberty, freedom, these concepts that we hold so dear and yet seem to have such little historical understanding of, and so little understanding of where our civil liberties are headed in the future. So I think it's important to understand where democracy came from, what its historical roots are, how that mixes with current economic and ecological changes. As we discussed in the prior slideshow, economy sets ecology, where people live, what the environment in which they live sets the stage for what kind of economy a group of people or a society can form, and that economy has a dominating influence over time over the social and political culture of the society as it is rooted in ecological and economic circumstance. That is very much a reality when you look at humans in a cross-cultural manner, but it's also very humiliating for our leadership, so we don't tend to see it that way. We have a lot of academics, politicians, preachers, everybody who gets up on a podium basically wants to convince you how important their ideas are, whether with good intent or bad intent. The net effect of that is to teach us that ideas are very important and dirt and oil don't matter. So if we're looking at the history of democracy, we look at ancient Greece as the birthplace of Western political democracy. What happened in ancient Greece for a few hundred years BC was indeed somewhat unique. There were, prior to that, the development of a number of early civilizations in various places around the world, but mostly in areas that had fertile river valleys, and we saw fairly despotic or centralized authoritarian kinds of political structures in those other civilizations. And then in ancient Greece there developed at least a limited democracy, and interestingly, and also a flourishing of philosophy and to some degree of science and medicine that then became the root of further development of science, medicine, philosophy, and political democracy in the Roman Empire and later in Europe. So let's look a bit at how that happened, or what happened. So Greece was not, ancient Greece, or modern Greece for that matter, is not a rainfall or not a river valley based society. It was not based in a single river valley. It was rather spread over the land, and the land itself was fertile enough to support a significant population, but it was not densely fertile. And as early as 425 BC, we have this quote from Plato, who of course is well known as a philosopher. Plato spoke of the formerly rich land that is like the skeleton of a sick man, with all the fat and soft earth having wasted away and only the bare framework remaining. So the Greeks grew on their island, the population grew, the fertility of the land could only support a limited population growth, so they turned to warfare. What was unique about ancient Greek civilization was that it was the first large-scale imperial civilization. They had an enormous army, Athens in particular, and quite some fairly elaborate ships, military ships. You can see the pictures here, a combination of rowing by slaves and sail-powered ships. At the peak of her democratic period, Athens held 160 city-states subject to her rule and was at war 2 years out of 3 throughout the 400s BC. Democracy was understood as synonymous with empire. So what we call democracy in ancient Greece was limited to to men, property-owning men, almost all of whom owned slaves. The slaves themselves were never involved in the democratic process. Women were never involved in the democratic process, not to any extent. So when we think of democracy in the modern context, we think of modern civil liberties movements that have incorporated a lot of previously disenfranchised groups. But when we're looking at these ancient democracies, what we're talking about is an oligarchic class, a group of business people who got together and decided they could run their business they could run their warfare, they could run their imperialism more effectively through a negotiating process with each other rather than through a single potentate, a single king. So that's what they did. And for several centuries, Greek was ruled as a democracy. Here's the Acropolis of Greece, where they met and just talked their politics. So ancient Greece then is the birthplace of both democracy and empire. And my argument is that empire is, that democracy is an outgrowth of empire. Democracy as we understand it. It is fundamentally oligarchic. It's a process by which economically empowered people express that power in the political forum. And I'll say that one more time. We think of democracy as this mental accomplishment, but if you look at it historically, democracy is the process by which economically empowered people express that power in the political forum. That has always been true, and it remains true. If we look at the fall of democracy as Greek imperialism succumbed to the increasing power of other imperial states in the area, not the least of which was Rome, democracy fell, and they reverted to a more authoritarian, centralized rule as their military exploits became less profitable. You see the same pattern in Rome, very similar pattern. Rome again was fertile enough to support a growing population, but not a tremendous river valley civilization like we saw, like you might see in the Indus River Valley in India, or the Yellow River Valley in China, or in Egypt with the Nile. Those were other civilizations where there was this large, very fertile river valley in which a highly centralized authoritarian government operated. In Rome, as in Greece, the agriculture was more spread out, therefore political power started in a more spread out fashion, was less centralized. But as population grew, they turned to empire once again to meet the pressures of a growing population. As early as 95 BC, Roman philosophers lamented the forests that are receding higher up the mountains, yielding ground to agriculture. The ecological stress of a growing population was felt very early on, and Rome did as the Greeks did, turned to military empire. The top picture here you see is a reenactment of Roman military strategy. They took the Greeks' military strategies and advanced them, took them to another level. Prior to the invention of the musket, the Roman sword, short stabbing sword, is said to have killed more humans on the face of the earth than any other weapon. You see the various weapons they have lined up there, their spears and swords, and the what we would now call a kind of a crossbow, those gizmos across the top up there. So various weapons of war, and again, the big for their age, warships, a combination of rowing by slaves and sails to move these ships around the Mediterranean and conquer so much of the land that they did. Rome is, at the peak of the Roman imperial period, they developed a significant degree of democracy. The Roman plebeian assembly, similar to Greek democracy, it was made up of land-owning men, mostly slave-owning men. Slaves and women did not participate, but the plebeians became the dominant political force for a period, at least in Roman history. They gained the right of access to the courts, gained the right to vote, gained a number of rights. And again, it was oligarchic in nature. It was not a grassroots kind of democracy. It wasn't anything like the democracy we have that has developed later on in Western Europe. And the ecological price of empire was relentless. By the 3rd century A.D., St. Cyprian wrote, "The world has grown old and has not retained its former vigor. It bears witness to its own decline. The husbandman is failing in his field. Springs which once flowed profusely now provide only a trickle." So the picture on the left is not St. Cyprian, that's Augustus. He was the Roman Caesar who took Rome from being a limited democracy back to being a dictatorship. Again, under the threat of military pressure. was the primary factor driving Rome back towards a centralized authoritarian government. The political pressure in this case was being generated by a multifaceted social movement. You see one of the earliest images of Jesus Christ, and this is a very loaded slide, I'll warn you, that the early Christians had been painted as a pacifist movement by the history that was written 300 years after the movement. And if you think of a movement today of historians writing about it 300 years after it passed, well, of course, you're talking about mythology at that point. The real writing, which comes from Josephus and Tacitus and the other writers that were alive at the time of the early Christian movement, are very clear and it's unmistakable that the early Christian movement was a military messianic movement, which we have seen many, many, many of in human history. Che there is in the middle. He was a modern military messiah of sorts, and of course the witch burnings that we went through in the Inquisition, that was another period when we had military messiahs, people who got together, tried to organize the poor people, the disenfranchised, in revolutionary movements to try to oppose the oppressive empires that were ruling over them. So we see this succession of revolutionary leaders, and the early Christian movement was an early revolutionary movement. And interestingly, this image, this early image of Christ shows him wearing military dress and crushing his enemy, the serpent. So under the strain of fighting various revolutionary movements, fighting various uprisings all over the empire, the Romans reverted back to an authoritarian government. Now let's talk about the development of democracy in Europe, particularly in England. It's interesting to note the same pattern played out, although obviously somewhat different. But in this case, in England in particular, we think of Parliament as being a backbone institution of democracy. Interestingly, Parliament preceded modern democracy in England by about 500 years, 5 centuries. The earliest Parliament was the Witan, as it was called, which dates back to the early 11th, 12th century in England. Interestingly, the King of England never actually had the power to make war unilaterally, never really had the power to collect taxes unilaterally. What the Witan was about, the king's job primarily at that point in history was to organize the defense and the offense of society. In other words, the king would bring together the various princes and vassals from princes and princelings from around the country. And these princes were largely independent. Again, we have a rainfall-based agricultural system. The king would bring them together and say, well, the French are going to invade, or we need to invade the French. He would try to give them a pitch for defensive or offensive military operations and then ask them for money. And they would usually give the king some money, sometimes not, depending on historical circumstance, which naturally changed quite a bit over various events over the course of centuries. But in any case, the king would ask the princes for money. For military adventures, the princes would give the king money, and then the king would set off on offensive or defensive military adventures. But it was the princes could decline. They could say, no, we're not going to give you money, and sometimes they did. But that Witan, that Parliament, as it later became called, was the meeting at which the king, and it only happened once a year, once every 2 or 3 years, depending. In an emergency situation, it would still take several months to bring the princes together to ask them for money. So even if there was an invasion, it would take months to respond to it. But the Witan, the early Parliament, was the meeting at which the king begged his princes for money. By the 1300s, there's a significant economic expansion going on in spite of the Black Death, or to some degree helped along by it, because the Black Death actually pushed wages up quite a bit because of a shortage of labor, at least for a time. And I have a quote here from a book by Ronald Butt, A History of Parliament. The underlying explanation for the increasing tendency to call knights and burgesses to Parliament was their greatly rising prosperity and social influence and the remarkable economic expansion which took place in the 13th century. There was an unprecedented increase in population. New land had recently been marsh or forest was brought into cultivation. Though still small, towns and boroughs had grown into an oases of comparative independence from the feudal obligations, which were still prevailing, if waning, feature of economic and social relationships in the countryside as a whole. So in the 13th century, this is actually prior to the Black Death, but the process proceeded through the Black Death, although with some disruption. There was tremendous economic growth, and the expansion of social influence among knights and burgesses, as he's calling them in this quote, led to an increasing size of Parliament. We go back to democracy is the process by which economically empowered people express that power in the political forum. So in a growing economy, as more people are incorporated into that oligarchic class of people who have power, of people who have influence, Parliament grew, and it grew steadily over the centuries, and incorporated more and more and more of these upstart businessmen, as we'd now call them. That process of economic expansion continued in England for centuries. In the United States, it took hold, at least among the conquering European civilization of the United States. And as different ethnic groups, as different previously disenfranchised minorities gained economic power, they gained access to the democratic process. Not without struggle, not without demanding it. Power is always given, never taken. Power is always taken, never given. So it's not an automatic process. It's not that if women or some ethnic minority is in a position where they gain more wages, they suddenly automatically gain more power. No, but having economic power gives you a political basis on which to stand to demand political power. So the rise of feminism, we see the feminist protesters in this picture, followed a significant economic expansion in the United States of women being involved in the labor force. Interestingly, the same was true for the civil rights movement. After World War II, there was still an enormous amount of racism, obviously, in the United States, a lot of underpaying of black workers, but nonetheless, the rate of wage increase for black workers after World War II was higher than for whites. It was quite high by historical comparison, starting from a low point perhaps, but nonetheless, if you're a woman, your husband is bringing home all the money, then you have to put up with more. If you're an African American and you're very, very poor, it limits your political organizing abilities. As you gain economic power, as people gain economic power, they gain both expectation and the economic foundation on which to seek political power. Democracy is the process by which economically empowered persons express that power in the political forum. That has historically always been true. It has always been based on empire. It has always been based on economic growth. Democracy has always been a product of empire, which is itself a product of ecological collapse of homeland agricultural economies. We talked about that in Greece and Rome as the somewhat fragile ecological farmland systems in those societies collapsed. They developed these sprawling empires to deal with their own population growth. Number two, democracy has always been oligarchic, instituted from the top down as economic growth allows. If we look at the development of European democracy, of course we talked some about England, but the three primary first democratic nations were England, France, and the Netherlands. Those, not coincidentally, were the first three big colonial powers, the first big empire builders. And they developed a large oligarchic class, which among itself, or within itself, developed democratic procedures, limited democratic procedures. If you look at the second-tier powers, democracy has always been limited to the imperial winners. Second-tier powers either become imperial plunder Eastern Europe in the colonial era, China and India in the 20th century, or develop more authoritarian governments to resist the incursions, intimidations, and bribery of the indigenous upper class by the first-tier powers. So let's go through that a little bit here. We have the second-tier powers, which were Russia, Germany, Japan, and Eastern Europe to an extent, as these first-tier powers, the countries we talked about previously, developed into these very powerful colonial imperial nations. The second-tier powers were in a situation where the first-tier powers were constantly trying to meddle in their politics, and their most effective means to meddle, the most effective way to dominate another country is to go in and basically buy off the existing oligarchy, to go to the existing political powers and try to get them to cooperate with colonial exploitation, basically. And the places where that was successful were China and India. And China and India both, the British in particular, were very effective at co-opting the local oligarchies and making those nations, China could hardly be called a nation prior to the World War II era, but in any case, making those nations completely subject to British colonial rule, and they did it by getting the local powers to cooperate with the British. And they exploited China and India quite severely. And when other countries like Japan or Germany or Russia or the people in those countries, it is in their interests to have a more authoritarian government, to have more nationalistic leaders who can resist their own oligarchs within their own society who are motivated to try to cooperate with the first-tier colonial powers. So there's a strong motivation in when you're a second-tier power to have strong nationalistic movements, which basically means, by our definitions now, less democratic. So Japan, Germany, and Russia were in much better shape than India or China because they developed stronger, more central governments with more authoritarian rulers who could more effectively resist the colonial incursions of the primary imperial powers, the British being the most powerful among them. So we look at democracy as being this great intellectual achievement and sort of ignore the international ecological economic context of how it develops or what the choices different countries face. Democracy has always been supported by decentralized economic systems, rainfall agriculture versus irrigation agriculture, and river valleys. So in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, as it was called historically, we had the development of ancient civilizations around that river valley. In the Yellow River Valley in China, there were the development of large, centralized authoritarian governments. In the Indus River Valley in India, we see that as well. The lesson is very clear. Centralized economic power supports centralized political power. Decentralized economic power supports decentralized political power. It's very important for us going forward. Democracy has always been based on a blind form of cultural evolution that systematically suppresses a rational understanding of cultural evolution and a real distribution of power. So we call the modern world democratic, the Western powers, but it's still very much an oligarchic democracy, and it's still very much an imperial form of democracy. And it's still as blind as it was thousands of years ago. And that latter point is the most important. I think it's the most difficult to understand, and it's the hardest pill to swallow, and most people aren't going to swallow it because they don't want to, because it's too humiliating to think of ourselves as technologically, we're so sophisticated, obviously. We can build all these incredible machines that we build in our age, and to say that we are socially, we have not developed. We have a cultural system that is as blind as it was thousands of years ago. People just don't want to think that way. But that is the simple truth, that a cultural system that is highly stratified is highly self-blinding. It has to be. And that self-blinding nature of highly stratified social systems disallows or stops the development of any real social science. We have something we call social science, but it's not real science, not in any practical sense. The expansion of democracy has always been a product of economic growth. Our society is no more humane, rational, and conscious than those primitive practices, whose primitive practices we disdain. Our mechanical technology has advanced, our social technology has not. There's a problem with so much abject poverty, with so much poor distribution of wealth. We have to have ways of rationalizing that. We have to have ways we have a cosmology that allows us to think that's okay, given the gross unsustainability of industrial civilization, given that industrial civilization is on a very short run in historical context. It's going to begin a severe contraction within most of our lifetimes. These are things that are so disturbing to our cosmology, we just don't want to know about them. There's so many things we don't want to know about. We systematically maintain a blind culture. There's a very systematic process by which we teach our children to not think about, to not rationally analyze our social systems, our social structures, our own human cultural evolution, so we aren't disturbed, perpetually disturbed by these demons lurking out there of unsustainability and inequality. But because we have put so much work into not understanding democracy, into not understanding our own cultural evolution, we have failed to notice that there is, in fact, a human cultural evolutionary process that is not that difficult to understand. And if we understood it, there's at least the theoretical possibility we can develop a whole new form of human social organization. That sounds grandiose, so it is. But a form of human social organization, a form of human cultural evolution that consciously understand the history of human social cultural evolution, that it understands cultural evolution and then guides that process forward. We're capable of doing that. We could choose to do that. Much of our history remains hidden in plain sight before our very eyes because it is humiliating to our academic, political, and religious leadership. Our histories focus on trivialities, the personal triumphs and failures of famous personalities. By turning these trivialities into causal agents of historical change, those in power in the current time seek to legitimize and justify their power. This is important because the long curve of history is now turning. So we focus on all these political leaders, all of their trials and travails, while ignoring the basic economic international context of how democracy has developed, the ecological and economic roots of it, how democracy has developed as empires have developed. That blue curve you see at the bottom of this multi-layered graph is what I would call the long curve, or one graphical representation of the long curve. The long curve is economic and ecological change. The short curve is political, cultural change. We think of we focus on the short curve, the political, historical change, because it's so exciting, because it focuses on the power of leadership, when in fact the long curve dominates the short curve over time. As long as the long curve and short curve are headed in the same direction, which they have been, the upslope of that big blue curve is the historical expansion of oil production that has facilitated economic growth, which has increased the number of economically empowered persons, many of which have successfully created a place for them in an expanding democracy. When the long curve and the short curve are headed in the same direction, we can pretend that the short curve is the long curve or dominates the long curve, when in fact historically the opposite is true. The long curve dominates the short curve. So the long curve of economic and ecological change, as it turns downward, will begin to pull the short curve along behind it. It can be no other way, especially as long as we are dominated by our own blind culture. That big blue curve at the bottom is global base oil supply, not the frack oil and all this other stuff that grows fast and climbs fast. These are the big, easily pumped out oil wells, and they are in decline. So as that base energy energy supply declines, it puts increasing strain on the economic foundation of industrialism. Specifically, oil production gets a lot less efficient. 100 years ago, we could get 100 barrels of oil for every one we invested. Now we're probably averaging maybe 15. Some oil wells, the tar sands are even as low as 3. In other words, you put in 1 barrel of oil worth of energy to get back 3. It's pretty pitiful. That's the long curve. We think of that as being separate from democracy, separate from civil liberty. It is in fact not. It is the very basis of democracy and civil liberty. Future democracy can only be sustained on a localized, decentralized, sustainable economy. So if we take the historical lessons of democracy, that it develops more easily in rainfall-based economies, that it is fundamentally tied to economic power, that we are now facing a decline of the loan curve, but we have a lot of modern, interesting tools that can help us choose our own future. We can decentralize our own economies. If we take economic power back at the local level, that could be the foundation of a new form of democracy, a localized, grassroots-based culture based on a conscious understanding of human cultural evolution, where we choose our economy. We choose who we buy from, who we buy from, who we interact with economically. If we can get to a point where we have localized economies around the world that are not primarily economically dependent on centralized corporate power, then that will be the basis of a future democracy. If we remain dependent on centralized corporate power for our food, for our water, for our transportation, for our energy, we will live as their slaves. In fact, we are effectively already enslaved. We are just simply very comfortable slaves. That the comfort level of our slavery will decline. But back when the irrigation-based agricultural civilizations, in the Indus River Valley, Yellow River Valley, these ones we talked about previously, they were still peasant farmers. They still grew their own food, but they were dependent on a central authority for water. And that dependency on water was enough to allow that central authority to have, over time, absolute power over the lives of peasants. Now we are far more dependent than they ever were. We are dependent for our daily food, for our water, for every little thing that we need to survive now. So we are already very deeply enslaved. We are simply not aware of it because we are so very comfortable. We have an illusion of democracy. We are not living in a democratic system at this point, a democratic society, because the economic basis of that society is so centralized. It has become so centralized that democracy is illusory. As that long curve turns, it will be things will change so fast it will make your head spin. Specifically, we will do what the Romans did, what the Greeks did, as we face quote-unquote increasing terrorists, which class conflict around the world. The people who are left out of this great democratic expansion, as industrialism declines, they will begin to fight back harder. Our response to them will be increasingly militaristic. That militarism will be the basis, the political justification for the collapse of traditional democratic rights. It's very simple, very obvious, very clear. It's amazing that we manage to hide this stuff from ourselves. It doesn't take much of a historian to find these things, to discover them, as it were, to see them in their true historical context. It's just a question of what you're willing to see, what you want to see. The antidote to all of that is for us to lead the curve, for us to develop our own localized economies, our own choose democracy, to choose our own dependencies at a local level rather than being so dependent on these corporate powers at such a higher level. So that's chapter 2. We're going to keep going with our slideshows. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. There will be a slideshow for each chapter going forward. Have a good day.